quiet. We got like a minute left. Whole minute. All righty, it is 10 o'clock on the dot. Time to get started. Everybody ready for a hot week? It's been blessedly mild up until this point, so thankfully we only have a few. Like, yeah, the heat index, that's what gets you. Feels like not a good time to be working in a warehouse. Be like, unless something blowing up, don't. Yeah, unless something's blown up, don't come to me. So, well, we have been talking about appointed positions within the church. We've talked about elders and deacons, and then last week we talked about the idea of a minister, and all Christians are ministers, um, but not all Christians are preachers, right? And not all Christians are paid ministers. And there is so much variance on when, where, why, and how. And it's really up to the local congregation to determine, the circumstances. As I was talking with someone this past week, up until I've said before about the 1940s or 50s, most preachers, the way we would think of it, were what were called vocational or bivocational. They had another job, so they were a farmer and a preacher, a school teacher and a preacher, a writer, or a publisher and a preacher. And so very frequently they would have multiple occupations. And so, but it doesn't remove Paul's statement that, it's fine for a local congregation to pay someone to preach and teach and minister. But you have to be careful that we don't remove the responsibility from the individual Christian to minister. So we are all called to minister. Another term for this appointed position is a preacher or a proclaimer, a herald of divine truth, someone who preaches and engages in public proclamation. So Paul references that in 1 Timothy 2, 2 Timothy 1. The next term that we're going to go over very briefly is found in Acts chapter 21 and verse 8. And we read in Acts 21 and verse 8, on the next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip the evangelist. We also see the term in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 5 when Paul says to Timothy, let me get over there, he admonishes him and says, as for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfilling your ministry. And so there we see the relationship of evangelist and ministry. And we're used to this term, right? We traditionally use the term evangelism. We're familiar with that term, right? And all of that comes from the Greek, as you trace it back, euangelion, which is translated the gospel or good news, right? So an evangelist is a proclaimer of the good news, right? The activity or the verb of evangelism is the action of proclaiming the good news, right? So they're all related. So, based on that, where do you think an evangelist spends most of their time and focus? Proclaiming, preaching, okay, with the unsaved, right. And that's an interesting distinction, right? Because, you know, um, we all have roughly the same amount of time in a week. And let's say you have a preacher on staff who is full-time, right? And theoretically, they work 40 hours a week, although I've never met one that actually did. But you work 40, 50 hours a week on average. It becomes the question of, okay, we expect the man to teach probably 1 to 2 Bible classes, preach 1 to 2 lessons, do all of that teaching, preaching, preparation. Maybe we ask him to write the bulletin. Some churches, some congregations ask him to edit the bulletin. Then he's going to have a couple of meetings every week because maybe there's a elders meeting or a men's meeting or something like that. And then we statistically ask him to do visitation. That is traditionally a thing that is asked of them. So then we're up to 4 lessons, a bulletin article, a couple of meetings, and probably a few more other things that I'm neglecting to remember at this time. And so then the question becomes, with what time remaining does he seek and save the lost? Right? That's the question. And that's the eternal challenge or the ever-present challenge that congregations have, right? The focus of evangelism or the focus of an evangelist is someone who is reaching out to the lost, right? And so if he spends, and it's not uncommon to spend 20 or 30 hours on preparing and delivering lessons in a week. When I was first in ministry, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 lessons almost every week, right? That was a lot. Yeah, I was also in my 20s at the time, so that helped, right? No kids helped, but 5 or 6 lessons a week, and that's kind of average. Well, it just depends. But I tell you what, there's a lot of congregations where that's the expectation. And I say all that to say that, like, you can't be good at everything, but you also have to decide where you want the focus to be, right? So maybe, because here's the thing. Paul traveled with, 3, 4, 5 guys at a time, right? And so, he talks to Paul or to Timothy and to Titus, and these are preachers who would travel with him, but he has put them in Ephesus or Crete, depending on the situation, for Titus to, quote, set things in order, right? But very frequently what would happen is Paul would come into an area and he would focus on the initial teaching, the initial evangelism. Then there would be a group of people who would work on the growth, the teaching the way we think of it. So the Bible class and the personal Bible study and that kind of thing, right? That's why in Corinthians, Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, right? And so it was very rare that Paul took care of everything. He was an evangelist, right? That was his primary focus. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't teach, right? That doesn't mean that he didn't, work with Christians. It meant that the thing that he spent the bulk of his time doing was trying to seek and save the lost. And so as we think about roles and positions, that's kind of where it comes to. Sometimes you'll hear me use the terminology, are we inward focused or outwardly focused, right? So, because we could, again, we have a finite amount of time, energy, and resources. We could spend a lot of that time focused inwardly. But if we spend time focused inwardly, that's time that we're not spending focused out, right? Both, let me be very clear, both are important, right? You can baptize 100 people. We could do it. But if we lose them, 95 of them within the first year, that's a problem as well, right? Whereas if we baptize 10 and we keep 10, then, we're doing pretty good, right? So it's a balance. And every congregation struggles with the balance. And, it's not every congregation, we're going to talk about the differences in congregations, but every congregation, struggles with it. And at various and sundry times, has to adjust how they do things. Any thoughts, questions, or comments on that? So, Greg? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We might. Um, Definitely. Yeah. 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 So we do have it going on. It's maybe just not as I'm gonna pick a term, Tom. Just go with me on this. Maybe not as formal a process as it was before. Not to insist that Tommy doesn't prepare, but what you mentioned sound like a very planned, structured thing. We had zones, right? Yeah. Now we have Tommy. You know, um, and so, but if we drill down though, and so because and talk, because you mentioned kind of the logistics, so there were zones, and if something happened in a zone, then there was a study that happened in a person's home, et cetera, et cetera. But if you drill down to what is the actual big picture of what happened, a person is converted, right? Someone then continued to study with them because there's a lot of stuff to know, right? Like becoming a Christian's the easy part. Living as a Christian is the hard part. That's the continual journey, right? And then it's the developing of relationships, right? And so that's part of it. And so it is continued study, developing relationships, and work, putting in that effort, right? Those are kind of the big pictures. Well, as we said, we're still doing that. The question becomes, that takes time, energy, and resources. Thankfully, we've got Tommy who steps up and does that, right? And so, but it's not to say that Tommy has to be the only one doing it, right? And so there's a lot of variables at play there. And it all goes back to, and that, kind of brings us to the next term, which is a teacher, right? In 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 3, Paul says to Timothy, um, he says, as I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. All right? And so we find out a lot in one verse. All right? Paul left Timothy at Ephesus, right? So here was the ministry team. Paul's preaching and evangelizing and doing work, and he leaves, and he says, Timothy, you're going to stay at Ephesus. Now, what does Timothy do while he's in Ephesus? Well, he teaches and preaches, but the majority of the context of 1st and 2nd Timothy has to do with right doctrine, elders and deacons, right? Not being lovers of money, being servants. And so, but what's more than that is that Timothy is not only engaging in teaching, but he's also training other teachers or instructing other teachers, right? Because Paul says in verse 3 that you may charge certain persons, which charge we think of like, I caught a charge, right? We think of it in the I'm going to jail kind of charges. The charges were dropped. But a charge can simply mean an instruction or a declarative or a mission, right? That can be a charge. The charge I make to you, I'm giving you this responsibility. And so Paul says in verse 3 of 1 Timothy 1 that you may charge certain persons or tell certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. So that if you are going to engage in teaching, which the expectation is that they were, you need to not get off into the weeds or go chasing false doctrine. And so we find that Timothy engages as a teacher, but he also is looking at other people to be teachers. In Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12, the Hebrew writer says this. I will not try to quote it because I am no good at quoting. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. So the Hebrew writer says to the audience that he is writing to, you should be teaching people, right? Now, we, again, have streamlined a lot of processes, right? And so we have adopted a very classroom style of teaching these days, right? You have a person at the front at a lectern, hello. You have a group of students seated facing the teacher, right? But that's not necessarily how it was back in the day. That did happen, right? But you also had people who would be circled up and instruction happened that way. You would have, just be sitting around and instruction happened that way. So teaching is a very wide topic, but the understanding is that Timothy, in addition to being an evangelist, in addition to being a preacher, was also considered a teacher, that he was expected to equip other people to be teachers, and that really and truly it's expected of Christians to be teachers. Now, that's a very broad term though, right? Anytime you instruct someone else, congratulations, you're a teacher. That's it. That's all you have to do to be a teacher, is you instruct someone else. Now, caveat to that, footnote, asterisk at the bottom of the page. You need to know what you're talking about in order to instruct someone, though, right? And so sometimes people, want to tell you how to do something that has no clue about what they're doing, right? And that's why the Hebrew writer says there in Hebrews chapter 5, that, you have to be retaught the basic principles, the basic oracles of God. For by this time, you ought to be on meat, not milk, right? So that you as a Christian should always be growing, and there should always be someone who you are able to teach, right? And the beautiful thing about teaching is there is as many diverse teaching styles as there are people, right? And so, it doesn't matter, what your style is. I've had some of the best biblical discussions standing around the back of a truck bed. Like I was just leaning up against a truck bed. And so, not in a classroom. So yours may be a little different. But it's that principle of commitment to instruction that is understood for all Christians. But there is a group who kind of, you know, does a lot of teaching, right? Elders are to be apt to teach, right? Preachers are regular teachers. So there are some people who do a lot of teaching, and that's fine. But as we look at the roles within the church, minister, preacher, evangelist, and teacher, right? That is a role within the church. And if you stop and think about it, you know, there's the casual teaching, which is you can do anywhere, but then there's also the kind of more appointed teaching of, hey, we trust you enough to let you teach in a group setting, right? And that's a big trust and a big responsibility, and so one that should not be taken lightly. But that is a position. That is somebody saying, hey, we want you to do this thing for us, and we trust your biblical knowledge enough to let you do that, right? So that's kind of a big deal, in my opinion. Thoughts, questions, comments on teachers or evangelists or any of that business? Why do you think we don't have more teachers? Or do we and we just don't realize it? Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, let's chase that. Oh. So then that begs the question, what role do teachers have in the spiritual development of their students? Right? So, because based on what Tommy said, and I agree, is that we have a lot of people who maybe aren't as spiritually mature as they ought to be, right? And there is a level of ownership, personal responsibility that comes with that. But is there also a responsibility that the teachers, the preachers have to the spiritual well being and that maturity as well? Mark? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, right. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And I think it's safe to say that, and you probably agree with this, Mark, once you start teaching, you really start growing a lot because it's challenging to be a teacher. Fun fact, you're going to be teaching even more as we keep going in the next year. Yes, ma'am. Hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree completely. I would say with that though that example is a powerful tool, right? Be a light, right? But And this is the challenge. And I don't think it's a problem for those people, but I think for people who look at those people sometimes, because, right, you look at a success story and you miss the 15 or 20 years of, drudgery that took them to get to that success story. You don't see the journey, you see the result. Is the understanding that there does come a moment where you do need to not just be a silent example, you need to be active in some way. But I think what happens is that those people who are looking at that example miss that sometime. We'll go Greg, then Tommy. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's like and that's the thing, right? Is there things that people can teach? Like you don't have to be able to teach every single thing. I think that's sometimes what we got. What happens if I don't have all the answers? Well, it happens to Matt a lot, and Matt goes, "That's a good question. I don't know. Let me look it up. Like, let me get back to you, because I don't know everything in the Bible. I know a bit, right? And so, but there's a lot I don't know, and there's always going to be stuff. Or somebody will like give you a hypothetical, like something that came across one of my social medias the other day was about the Pledge of Allegiance and should a Christian say the Pledge of Allegiance, and I was just like, I feel I know the answer to this, but I think it would behoove me to go back, listen to what this person has to say, and then go study my scripture and just double check that I'm on the right page, right? And honestly, had I not seen somebody I went to college with talking about it, would not have thought twice about it, right? Because it does that affect my everyday life? It does not. You know why? Because I'm not saying the Pledge of Allegiance at 7 a.m. anymore. When I was in elementary school, every morning, right? Now, not as much. Most that happens is the national anthem at a ball game, right? So, Tommy. Mm-hmm. 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 It is. Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah, which is all holiness is, right? And but yeah, 100% agree. And I think it's one of those situations where example and actual instruction, right, both come back to the topic of communication, right? They are both ways to communicate. If you communicate a good example, then when you say something to me, I'm going to listen, right? The other way works too, of if you say something to me and I see how you live, then I'm going to consider that authoritative, right? But if I don't see it, why should I listen to you, right? I think, again, it goes back to we get in our heads and tell ourselves we can't. I think Satan might hop in there as well. But the reality is everybody's got an opinion on something, right? Greg, you like to lease cars, right? Y'all lease your cars. Not anymore. Okay. So, but you have up until now. Yeah, and so you could probably talk to me pretty eloquently about why y'all made that decision, right? Huh? Tax rate, right? You got risen, right? So there's a logic in it for you. You could talk to me about. Everybody has something you can talk about, right? All right. Why did you pick that iPhone? Right? Well, it was the one that worked simply. It was the one that I could just hit it and it worked. Or I've always had iPhone. You have opinions on stuff and you talk about stuff. You know why? Because none of us walk around mute, right? You all have something in which you will talk about, right? There are some people who will talk about something and you wish they wouldn't, right? And so it becomes, what about your faith can you talk about, right? And so it doesn't always have to be book, chapter, and verse. But you show up here at 10 o'clock on a Sunday, I guarantee you can articulate to somebody why. What matters so much, right? And that is a conversation. That is a teachable moment. You know, and so, we get sometimes stuck in our head about the systemic nature of teaching or the system of teaching, right? We like checklists and patterns and systems. You know why? Because it makes it easy, right? Check, 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 check. Boom, didn't forget anything, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. For the longest time in Christian history, it was not that way. And so it's just a matter of one individual with knowledge and example and experience caring enough to instruct another person. And again, that's a responsibility for all Christians. But as we were talking about the work of the church, there are some Christians who engage in that teaching just a little bit more, right? And so that's why James talks about the fact, right, that teachers are judged doubly, right? I don't think he means the average Christian teacher. I don't think he means the person who's just communicating the gospel. I think he's talking about the me and the Mark and the Tommies and the Gregs who engage teaching the masses, right? That is who I think that is geared towards. Mark? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And but Paul goes on to say, "Woe unto me if I don't preach the gospel." Right? Right? That's a discussion I have had many, many a time. I remember, so as everybody knows, I've got some health issues, and they started back during the pandemic, and was having a conversation. I was having anxiety, panic attacks, couldn't sleep. I had insomnia, all of those things. Like I would go days without sleeping, and it was the pandemic. We were all having a hard time, right? And so, but we were losing members left and right. It felt like I lost a very dear friend of mine, Stan, who was just a wonderful, wonderful Christian man. If I can be half the man he is, I'll have done all right. And I couldn't and so I went to the doctor, right? Because I was thinking, something, right? Maybe my heart's given out, maybe whatever. And so they ran the test, all that, nothing happened, right? Nothing like we can't find anything medically wrong with you, Mr. Neely. Have you considered maybe it is not a physical problem? And I was like, no. But wanting to examine all possibilities, I went to a therapist and we started talking and we started going through the symptoms and they're like, what do you do again? You work in a hospital? No. I work for a church. Ah. It's called compassion fatigue. I'm sorry, what? Compassion fatigue. When you work in a field, whether it be a hospital or, any number of things, and, social work, and you have to invest so much in people, right? And maybe those people pass away or things happen. You basically wear yourself out to this point where it's kind of like burnout, but there's more to it than that. And but yeah, it's the same thing that happens with nurses and doctors and people who work in emergency rooms and et cetera, et cetera. Cool. I have a term. Awesome. So what do I do to fix it? She said, quit. What's door number 2, Doc? You know, because, right, I feel a responsibility and a call to serve, right? And so what I did was I negotiated. And so they told me, they said, well, if you keep doing it the way you're doing it, you're going to die. And it's like, well, I'm going to die someday, but I would rather not expedite the appointment. So that's when I made the shift into part-time work. But I can't, I can never see myself in a position where I don't serve in some capacity, right? And so it is a responsibility. There is a weight to it. But here's the thing, that judgment, that we were talking about, there comes a certain point where you go, but God gave me the ability to teach or to talk to people. I need to do it to whatever capacity I am able to do it, right? And so sometimes, the capacity is a lot, sometimes it's a little, but the desire, the pressure, the need, that's there. And so I think the goal is, because we know what it's like to be excited about something, right? I think about a kid who gets excited. Remember when a kid will come up to you and it's like, I got a lollipop, right? Or see my new stuffy, right? What does it take for us to go, see my Savior, right? That level of excitement, right? Because when we get excited about something, when we love something, when something is consuming of us, we want it comes out of us. We want to talk about it. And so I think the part of the journey, and we talked about that milk to meat journey, I can talk to you all day long about various doctrines, right? I can talk to you all day long about the idea of grace or the Trinity or, substitutionary atonement. Sure, I know all the $5 words, but what's the point in that if you don't have that excitement and love for Christ? What is the point in that? And so that's really step one, is having that desire and that excitement. And listen, let's be honest, it comes and goes. You always love the Lord, but some days you're tired, right? And so you got to rest, and then you go back at it, right? The point is, and this is kind of the way I look at people or look at it, is if everything's going okay, like if everything's hitting okay, right? What would you rather be doing? Would you rather be doing what you want to do or rather do what God wants to do? Would you rather be serving? Do you feel that desire to serve in some way? If you do, cool. Then just start down that path, figuring out how to do it and to what capacity. I know there was a brother in Christ, Chuck Ream, who has now passed on to his reward. Chuck had, I do not remember what it was, but he effectively had kidney failure. That's what it was. And Chuck scheduled his, what's that called when they put the port in you? Dialysis. Thank you. It's like, so he scheduled his dialysis such that he could still cut the church grass, because that's what his ministry was. And I talked with him one day and I said, Chuck, we could find somebody. He's like, no, Matt, nobody's going to do it as good as me. He said, because here's the thing. When people drive by, they see that we take care of things, and that makes an impression. And so that was his ministry was making sure that the yard looked good, so that if somebody drove by or borrowed our parking lot for whatever, that, it didn't look like there should, is a used Buick in the back 40. Like, that's what his ministry was. And so even though he had dialysis, he would still get out there and mow the yard on his zero turn. And so it's finding those things in which you can serve and be passionate about. So vitally important. We all can teach. We just have to find the ways in which we can teach. All right? Any other thoughts, questions, comments on that? Yeah, brother. Okay, so disciples. All right, so a disciple is a Christian. All Christians are to be disciples. Now, when you get into the Gospels, it frequently talks about the disciples, right? Or his disciples. Now, you have to look at context clues, right? Sometimes when it talks about the disciples, it's talking about the apostles. Sometimes when it's talking about the disciples, it's talking about those who were following Jesus during his ministry. You move over to to Acts and following, and disciples is frequently used to be a term for collectively Christians. There was not so there were a lot of terms for Christians in the first century, right? We find that they were first called Christians at Antioch, right? Well, what were they called before then, right? So they were sometimes called disciples, disciples of Christ, followers of the way, right? Christians, that sect of Jews, that new sect of Jews. There were lots of terms. But disciples is a very common collective term for all Christians. Now, what is a disciple? Okay. Well, a disciple is someone who has committed themselves to the teachings of their master, right? They are a disciple of that person. So that means that they have taken that knowledge, and it is their knowledge, and historically and statistically, they then take that knowledge and make further disciples, right? And so it is a perpetuating system, right? And for example, the American form of government. Do you think the founding fathers just all of a sudden went, aha, we have come up with a brand new form of government? No, they did not. They took ideas from overseas and they took them and modified them, but they were disciples of those various philosophers and thinkers and ideas, and then they took and founded our country, right? And so a disciple is merely someone who is sat at the feet of the master, a master, taken the instruction, and then takes that instruction, applies it, and teaches it on down the line. So all Christians are disciples. But it also implies a level of commitment. Because if you are a disciple, that means you have devoted yourself to teaching. So for example, in the first century, if you had a rabbi, right, there were lots of rabbis beyond Jesus. And so those rabbis would have disciples. And those disciples would leave everything and follow the rabbi. And those disciples would pay to take care of the rabbi while they were learning from him. And so the idea of being a disciple is a level of commitment. There is a book, and it's not written by a member of the church, so warning, disclaimer, do with that what you will. It is a generic Christian book, but I think the term is called More Than a Fan or Not a Fan or something along those lines. But it examines the difference between being a fan and a disciple, right? You can be a fan of the Browns, right? You can tell me everything there is to know about the Browns, right? But just because you know about something and like something doesn't make you a disciple. A disciple would be somebody who loves the Browns so much and wants everybody else to love the Browns, and then tries to get them to love the Browns, right? So you can love Jesus, you can know the Bible, but you could just be a fan of it. There are a lot of books I'm a fan of, right? I've got lots of books that I've read over my life that I like, and maybe I'll say, hey, you get a chance to read this book. But that's different than those books where you go, no, you have to read this book. Or you have to watch this movie. That tends to be what we do now. And so a disciple is someone who is more than a fan. A disciple is someone who has committed themselves to a philosophy, a teaching, and a way of life. So that is a choice, not an appointment, right? So ministers, all Christians are ministers. Some ministers are appointed, right? So I am an appointed minister by the congregation, right? All Christians are supposed to be proclaimers of the gospel, preachers. Some are appointed to do such, right? All Christians are to be evangelists. Some Christians are appointed a specific role to seek and save the lost. All Christians are to be teachers, all right? Some are appointed to teach in a more formal setting in which there are consequences. We are judged doubly, right? There are no appointed disciples. You have to make that choice. That this is the most important thing, and I am devoting myself to God. Any thoughts, questions, or comments before we wrap up? All right, well, we will pick up next week with the local congregation.